Hello and welcome to the 7th episode in our MCA mini-series. Firstly, we wanted to update you all on the implementation of Liberty Protection Safeguards, also known as LPS. We have explained in our previous episodes what LPS is and how we are preparing locally. Check those out if you haven't already. We are excited to say that the draft codes of practice and regulations are now released for consultation until the 7th of July. At the time of recording this episode, a date for implementation had not yet been set. But this doesn't stop us from being able to prepare and ensure our MCA and deprivation of liberty practice is at an excellent standard now. So, let's talk about deprivations of liberty. Deprivation of liberty, a timeline. Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights refers to our right to liberty and security. Liberty, in simple terms, means us having freedom to do as we please. Article 5 states that we have the right not to be deprived of our liberty, meaning arrested or detained, except in limited cases. For example, when someone is suspected or convicted of committing a crime, or where the deprivation of liberty is justified by a clear legal procedure. In the world of adult health and social care, a well-known case called the Bournemouth ruling in 2004 highlighted that the individual involved had been unlawfully detained, breaching their right to liberty and security. This led to the implementation of Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards, also known as DOLS, which provides legal safeguards to people aged 18 plus who have a mental disorder, who are being deprived of their liberty in order to receive necessary care and treatment, and who lack capacity to consent to those arrangements. DOLS, however, is only applicable to deprivations taking place in care homes or hospitals. 2014 saw another big turning point in the deprivation of liberty timeline, the Cheshire West ruling. This landmark ruling by the Supreme Court brought about the acid test. More on that in a moment. This highlighted that individuals aged 16 plus, in line with the MCA, who live in the community, such as in their own homes or supported living, who lack capacity to consent to those arrangements, could also be being deprived of their liberty. But the current legislation DOLS didn't apply to them. This is where things get a little more complicated. This brought about the need for two different approaches to having deprivations of liberty lawfully authorised, something which LPS is going to simplify. If DOLS applies, these are authorised by the local authority in conjunction with a best interest assessor and a mental health assessor. If a person is being deprived of their liberty outside of the DOLS remit, aka in the community, or they are aged 16 to 17, then those are authorised by the Court of Protection. So what is the definition of a deprivation of liberty? Regardless of where the person is, we define whether someone is being deprived of their liberty through the application of the acid test. The acid test is made up of 3 parts, which ask whether the person in question is under continuous supervision and control and not free to leave. How do we identify that the acid test has been triggered? Different court cases over the past few years have helped us to clarify what each of these 3 elements of the acid test might look like in practice. But it is important to remember that circumstances amounting to a deprivation of liberty can look different for different people. This is not a one-size-fits-all. Let's have a think about some examples. Continuous supervision. This does not simply mean that the person is being physically watched at all times. We need to think of this more abstractly. Ask the question, does somebody know where this person is, roughly speaking, at all times? That might be because there are eyes on, or because of the layout of the environment, meaning the person can only be in certain areas, for example due to locked doors, or due to the use of assistive technology such as sensor mats, cameras, door sensors and trackers. Control. This element is seeking to identify who has the control over the care and arrangements this person is subject to. Is it the person themselves? Or is it that others control the care planning, when care takes place, where and how? If the latter is the case, then this element is triggered. Not free to leave. This is another abstract one. The question you should ask yourself here is, if the person attempted to leave or left the property but did not come back when planned, would we stop them or find them and return them? If the answer is yes, then that person is not free to leave. Free to leave means the person could walk out of the setting where they are receiving care or treatment, and nobody would stop them or attempt to find them and bring them back. Remember, the person may not be actively seeking to leave. That isn't a deciding factor. Where does capacity to consent come in? If we're saying yes to the 3 elements of the acid test, continuous supervision, control, and not free to leave, we then need to establish whether the person has the relevant capacity to consent to those arrangements. If they do have capacity and they consent, then an authorisation is not needed. If they have capacity but they do not consent, then the deprivation cannot continue. In some cases, you may need to seek legal advice here if the person is vulnerable and at high risk of significant harm. If the person lacks the relevant capacity to consent to their arrangements, then the next step is to consider: are all the arrangements in the person's best interests? Are they necessary? How do we know they are? What are the risks? What has happened to evidence how likely those risks are? Are they proportionate? Are you sure there is no other way to support the person, which means they wouldn't be deprived of their liberty? Could any of the liberty restricting measures in place be reduced? What else has already been tried and what was the outcome? Liberty restricting measures. Here are some ideas of restrictions which may cause you to look closer and consider whether a person is being deprived of their liberty. Use of assistive technology, sensor mats, door sensors, trackers, CCTV, bed rails, lap belts, one-to-one supervision, locked doors with no key or key code being provided to the person, medication which has sedative or behaviour controlling qualities, use of restraint, limits on access to internet or devices, care delivery controlled by others. Do not forget to be professionally curious. Don't assume that because a restriction is in place, it must therefore be in the person's best interests, necessary and proportionate. Ask the questions. And remember to regularly review any restrictions in place. Circumstances can change. What to do if you identify a possible deprivation of liberty. If the person's arrangements trigger the acid test, they lack the relevant capacity to consent to those arrangements, and they have a mental disorder, there are 2 options currently until LPS comes into force. If the person is 18 plus and being cared for in a hospital or care home, then DOLS applies. Please contact the DOLS team or confirm with the ward or care home manager that they have put an authorisation request through. If the person is living in a community or aged 16 to 17, then an authorisation will need to be sought via the Court of Protection. Please let the person's key worker know of the deprivation occurring, or contact the single point of access if there is no key worker. If you are unsure and need any advice, please contact your supervisor or line manager in the first instance. We would highly recommend that you complete our local MCA training pathway to gain further confidence and knowledge in this area. Book your places now via Optima or email our training team for support. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you never miss an MCA mini-series episode. See you all next time.